Why did George Washington not ascend to kingship? A triumphant leader, cherished by his citizens, dismantles the existing order and claims the throne for himself. This narrative has been recounted throughout history so frequently that it appears almost inevitable. Yet, George Washington defied such expectations and chose not to assume power after guiding his nation's revolution against Britain. But what were the reasons behind this decision? Why did George Washington refrain from becoming an American monarch? In this discussion, we will delve into the various factors influencing this choice. We will examine not only Washington's personal reluctance to embrace kingship, but also the sentiments of his supporters. Furthermore, we will explore the practical, philosophical, and even religious considerations that rendered the notion of an American king unfeasible, even had Washington desired such a role. Washington's motivation is logical to begin with the individual in question. Washington was an exceptional military leader and an inspiring figure, a fact that is indisputable. He successfully led the diverse American militia to triumph over the formidable British Empire. Numerous instances during the Revolutionary War, such as the crossing of the Delaware River and the victory at Yorktown, demonstrated Washington's resilience and character, earning him admiration and respect. If anyone were to be considered for kingship, Washington appeared to be the ideal candidate. Nevertheless, Washington had no desire for a crown. He was a staunch advocate of republicanism. John Adams described Washington's approach to power as noble and disinterested, and his anti-monarchical principles were respected by all the prominent founding fathers. Washington's commitment to these values was unwavering. Monarchy was regarded as fundamentally flawed, with pro-monarchy Americans labeled as disciples of despotism. Washington's commitment to this belief was evident in 1782, following a correspondence from Colonel Louis Nicolai, one of his officers. At that time, Congress was struggling to finance the army, leading to growing discontent among the troops. Some, including Colonel Nicolai, felt that new leadership was necessary, as Congress appeared incapable of fulfilling its responsibilities. In a letter dated May 22, 1782, Nicolai proposed that Washington take on the role of a king to guide the nation effectively, asserting that Washington's leadership would likely lead to smoother paths of peace. Washington found this suggestion deeply offensive. He stated, "No incident in the course of the war in me triggers painful feelings as your message that such ideas are circulating in the army, as you expressed it." The notion that his own soldiers could abandon Republican principles was shocking to him. He urged, "If you have any regard for your country, concern for yourself or posterity, or respect for me, banish these thoughts from your mind and never communicate them again." Washington indeed honored his words. He refrained from using his military authority to usurp civilian power after the war. On December 23, 1783, following the defeat of the British and the assurance of American independence, Washington resigned his commission before Congress. This act symbolized the relinquishment of military power in favor of civilian governance. After laying down his authority, he returned to his estate at Mount Vernon. This display of humility and restraint was so remarkable that even King George III acknowledged it, declaring Washington the greatest man in the world. Washington's actions mirrored those of one of his esteemed heroes, the Roman leader, who was a prominent and respected figure in Rome during the 5th century BC. Before returning to his cabbage farm after completing his duties, both Washington and Cincinnatus were called back to positions of authority. Cincinnatus served as dictator for a time, while Washington took on the role of president. Both individuals fulfilled their responsibilities with dedication and, upon the conclusion of their terms, peacefully relinquished their offices and returned to their farms. Notably, Washington declined the regal title of Your Excellency, opting instead for the more modest designation of Mr. President. The people's aspirations' reluctance to assume the title of king suggests a broader disinterest in power itself. He wielded authority only at the behest of the people. This raises the question of why the American populace refrained from elevating him to kingship. The most apparent reason lies in the fact that the revolution was fundamentally a rejection of monarchy. The colonists sought to dismantle the unchecked power of a monarch who, sanctioned by divine right, could not be removed by the populace without resorting to violence. The American people were invigorated by the principles of freedom. Communities aspired to self-governance, desiring liberation from unnecessary oversight. This ethos of liberty was a primary motivator for many settlers who journeyed to America. A monarchy simply did not align with this vision. Furthermore, the concept of kingship contradicted the emerging ideals of human equality that were propagated by the revolutions in both America and France. The notion that an individual could attain high office solely based on birth was antithetical to the revolutionary belief in natural rights. As articulated in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. While the realities of slavery and the treatment of indigenous peoples highlighted the limitations of this assertion, it nonetheless resonated in discussions surrounding power and governance. The tenets of liberty and equality, along with critiques of hereditary and monarchical authority, were powerfully articulated in influential works such as Thomas Paine's widely read pamphlet, Common Sense. The notion that the era of monarchies had concluded has already persuaded millions of Americans. It is arguable that the average American may not have engaged with the majority of the literature and essays that elaborated on these concepts. This assertion holds some validity. However, it is noteworthy that Thomas Paine's Common Sense was read by approximately 2.5 million individuals during the Revolutionary period. Regardless of the extent of their literary engagement with these principles, it is evident that the typical American embodied them in their daily lives. Alexis de Tocqueville, a French author, ostensibly analyzed American society in the years following Washington's passing. He remarked that the Republican ideals stemming from the Revolution remained deeply ingrained in American culture. He stated, "The people reign over the American political world as God rules over the universe." The early American populace was actively involved in self-governance and held a firm belief in the efficacy of popular politics. Tocqueville observed that political groups consistently formed around various issues and causes. Such a degree of political participation was unprecedented in Europe, even in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Rather than desiring a monarch, the American populace preferred to address their challenges independently. While they held respect for Washington, they were resolute in retaining their own power. Exploring the foundational documents of the United States reveals that the concept of monarchy was fundamentally incompatible with the nation's moral and philosophical underpinnings. A clear illustration of this can be found in the American understanding of legitimate authority. As a nation rooted in Christianity, it was believed that power originated from God, but was entrusted to the citizens of the United States, who chose to form states and establish a federal government. Authority was perceived to flow from the people to the states and subsequently to the federal government. The foundational premise of the American system was that individuals inherently possessed rights and powers, which they willingly allowed the government to regulate, to foster a cohesive society. In contrast, the monarchical system operates on a different principle. In a monarchy, the authority in this context was vested in the monarch, who would subsequently delegate it to subordinate officials. In Britain, this structure implied that the king, or later parliament, held the ultimate power, with all authority emanating from this central figure. Presently, regional governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland derive their powers from the sovereign's consent, which can be revoked at any moment. This stands in stark contrast to the American system, where the populace and individual states determine the scope of the federal government's powers, at least in principle. Consequently, the notion of monarchy was fundamentally incompatible with the American understanding of governance. Moreover, most monarchies traditionally necessitate religious endorsement. Monarchs have historically claimed a higher spiritual authority that distinguishes them from lesser officials. However, in America, the collective populace already possessed this divine endorsement, as they were believed to be granted certain inalienable rights by God, even if Washington had attempted to justify kingship on religious grounds. Such a rationale would have been nearly Although America identified as a Christian nation, it encompassed a multitude of Christian denominations, each with distinct theological beliefs and interpretations. Attempting to provide a religious basis for any governmental aspect beyond the most general terms would likely alienate segments of the American populace and could potentially lead to the collapse of the entire system. This concern is reflected in the First Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits the establishment of a state religion, as doing so would fracture American society and render the concept of a United States unviable. Furthermore, even when disregarding complex philosophical or religious debates, the American Revolution... The uprising occurred due to the belief that monarchy was fundamentally ineffective. No single individual, regardless of their abilities, could effectively govern a territory as extensive and diverse as the United States. Even the kings of England, who presided over one of Europe's most advanced and well-administered nations, were unable to maintain control sufficient to avert revolution. The notion of toppling an ineffective monarchy only to establish another equally ineffective one was inherently illogical. Even if George Washington had been appointed as king, and if, by some extraordinary circumstance, the American populace had relinquished their principles to permit this, it is improbable that he could have established a monarchy capable of effectively governing the United States. The scale of the nation was simply too great for any one individual to oversee. Moreover, had Washington been suited for such a role, he passed away without heirs, raising significant concerns regarding succession. Historically, there have been very few individuals endowed with the requisite talent and humility to follow in Washington's footsteps. Thus, such a monarchy would have been destined for failure. The reason Washington did not ascend to kingship is straightforward. He had no desire for it, nor did the American populace. Their revolution was a rejection of monarchy. Their societal structure did not endorse it. Their values were in direct opposition to it, and the practicalities of governing the United States would have rendered it unfeasible. Consequently, Washington became the first president of the United States and, depending on one's perspective, is often regarded as its finest.